Chapter 7, Lecture 2 is a continuation of Lecture 1, and it's going to start talking about how our climate really determines where organisms can live. In other words, what type of biomes are present. If you take a look at our region, of course, here we're actually a little bit more temperate deciduous than that actually shows. And a lot of that is driven by the geological features. Also, in the United States, prevailing winds are going to come in this way into the United States, and what happens is we get nice lush green areas of California. Then we get this magical thing called the Rocky Mountains. What happens with the Rocky Mountains, of course, it creates a windward and leeward side. The rainfall can get up, it drops all the moisture on that nice moist area of California, but then the other side is left dry. Progressively then we get a little bit more moisture, and we get a grassland, and then we get into a temperate deciduous forest where we live. If you look at the equatorial regions are along here. I'm sorry, that's the Tropic of Cancer. If you now look at the equatorial region, which is right there, what happens is it tends to be hotter. Between the 0 and 30 degrees, we get areas like this where it's very dry, like the Sahara Desert. The Middle Eastern region is very dry too. So remember, latitude makes a big difference. Altitude makes a big difference also. Altitude, of course, is the higher you go up in a mountain range, as an example. As we get further away from the equatorial regions, we tend to get more deciduous. We tend to get more into coniferous forest. An example would be in Russia area. We get a kind of temperate grassland in here, and then we get into more of a coniferous forest here, and then we get more into an Arctic situation as we get away from the equatorial region. So let's dive into these different biomes. Desert, there's actually three main types of biomes. There's tropical deserts, there's temperate deserts, and there's cold deserts. They are very fragile ecosystems because the limiting factor is amount of precipitation. They generally get very, very small amounts of precipitation every year, which means that plants can't grow, which also means that decomposition cannot occur very fast, so they don't get nutrients back into the ground very quickly. So let's dive into different types of deserts. First, the tropical desert. This is a picture of a desert in Morocco. If you look at this thing to the right, which is called the climatograph, or also known as the climatogram, the months are on the bottom: January, February, March, April, May, etc. It's a double graph. On the left is temperature variation, and the line right here shows temperature variation. On the right is precipitation, and we generally show precipitation on the bottom here, generally in a bar graph kind of form. But what this shows me is a tropical desert is very warm year-round, not much variance in there, and it gets very little precipitation. The type of desert is a temperate desert. This is kind of like the deserts of the southwestern rather parts of the United States, particularly in California and Arizona. Temperate because they get varying temperatures. It gets really cold at night in these, but seasonally also what happens in a temperate desert is we get very cool temperatures, and they rise up in the summertime and they drop again, kind of like the region we live in, where we have cold winters and warmer summers. They get more precipitation than the tropical also, so that's a climatograph. The next one is a cold desert. This is kind of like the Gobi Desert of the Mongolian region. You can see it actually gets to the negatives in temperature. It's got fairly consistent rainfall throughout the year, but again, not very much a huge limiting factor, and it gets quite warm in the summertime. So again, that's a cold desert. Grasslands tend to be more interior on continents. They're too moist to be deserts. They're pretty dry though. A couple things about grasslands is they're very prone to fires. We get things in the United States like prairie dogs that are living in there, small things like rabbits and other rodents that live in those regions. There's three main types. There's a tropical, a temperate, and a cold. So look at those. This would be a tropical grassland, also known as a savanna. Lots of grazing hoofed animals, browsing animals that will move where the food source is. You can see on the picture there's not enough precipitation to create a lot of trees. There's that one tree there, that lonely tree, but they do get enough moisture to grow some grasses, and things like zebras live in here, hyenas live in here, lions live in here. Their temperature is very constant throughout the year, we've got different amounts of rainfall. We definitely have a rainy season starting in about September and going through about August, and then it dries out. When it dries out, that's when they're prone to. Another type of grassland, which is also known as a prairie. This would be kind of like in Kansas, in the United States, and Oklahoma, North and South Dakota are deemed grasslands. Also, prairies, they're temperate. Again, you can see differences in temperature from the high to low. Very temperate, very dry summers, tall grasslands. They get enough precipitation as compared to the savanna to grow taller grasses and quite a bit more shrubs and trees. Short prairie grasses, also tall prairie grasses, oftentimes converted to farmland because they do have a lot of nutrients. Generally not enough nutrients to sustain plants on their own, particularly farming plants, so we actually have to add a lot of nutrients to it. Again, even in the United States, these are prone to water. This is actually another type of grassland. This is the Arctic tundra. You probably have heard that term before. The tundra is associated with something called permafrost. What happens is the ground is permanently frozen. This would be like the northern reaches of Canada, the northern reaches of Russia. So what happens, we get very cold temperatures, minus 30, and it gets up to about 15-20 degrees Celsius, and that's about it. Very low rainfall. Also, plants are very close to the ground. They do have plants up there, things like lichen moss. Again, very sensitive area. One thing we'll talk about is the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge down the road, and that is an area where it's in the northern regions of Alaska where they want to drill oil. And one of the concerns about that is if we have an oil spill, these systems are very slow to recover because decomposition is very low. They don't have much bacteria. So if we had an oil spill, it would be devastating on the ecosystems. Animals have very thick fur in here, obviously, because they're a very cold region. There are animals like caribou up here, and of course what they do is they eat the moss that's growing. There's also an alpine tundra. Alpine always associated with trees. With trees and with mountains. In this case, what happens as you go up, and if you think about like Switzerland, for example, in the Alps, they have alpine tundra up there. It's above the tree line area, and it actually is associated with very cold temperatures, a lot of permafrost. So above the tree lines in the mountains tends to be very frozen. This is just a picture of what we do in the United States, of course, with our grasslands. We do convert them into fields, and that's a big field of wheat. And what they're doing is something called monoculture, which is where we plant one thing. The bad thing with monoculture is it takes lots of nutrients out of forests we're more familiar with. There's three types. There's tropical, temperate, and cold. This is a tropical rainforest, which you've probably studied quite a bit before. Very even temperatures throughout the year, lots of precipitation. Dry season kind of going on June, July, and August, but then we get more rain back in after the months of September. Tropical rainforests, of course, tend to be very hot and high moisture, lots of bacteria, lots of animals, very, very diverse areas, great biodiversity. Stratification of specialized plants and animal niches. Stratification means layers. This top layer that you can see on here is actually called a canopy, so that's a top canopy. Rapid recycling of scarce soil nutrients is very common to these regions. What happens is the plants die, and animals too, and they decompose so fast in here because it's so hot and there's a lot of moisture, so it promotes a lot of bacterial growth and fungal growth too. And then nutrients actually don't stay in the soil very long. They get back up into the trees and into the canopy very quick, so it's got very infertile soil. Human impact on these, of course, is the biggie, is we're cutting these down, and more of those later. Here's just a little picture of different stratification within the tropical rainforest. Down here we get one type of bird down in the bottom. We get a tapir growing down here. We get an opossum living up in the tree here. We get a toucan. We get an eagle living up here. And there's just millions and millions of different species that live, everything from bacteria to birds to other animals, rodents, bigger animals that live in the jungles, of course. We'll talk about that stuff. This type of forest you should be very familiar with. That picture is like in the region we live, a temperate deciduous forest. Temperate because we've got varying temperatures, pretty much consistent rainfall throughout the year. That can change a little bit from year to year, obviously, whether we're in an El Nino season, La Nina season, there's some other variables too. But what happens is it's called temperate because of the varying temperature, deciduous because our trees in a survival means lose their leaves in the winter. Cooler temperatures, less moisture in this region, but we have very fertile soil in this region because when a tree dies, when an animal dies, they decompose relatively quickly, and those nutrients tend to stay in the ground for a long time. Broadleaf deciduous trees, slow rate of decomposition. It is slow, but it is much faster than a tundra region, and it's much faster than a grassland too, not nearly as fast as a tropical rainforest. Human impacts, we do cut a lot of these trees down and turn them into farmland. And there's some again. The third type of forest is called the northern coniferous forest. Just so you know, it's also called a boreal forest. It's also called a taiga. Temperate, not quite as extreme as a temperate deciduous forest, but we do have some swings in temperature between winter and summer. Water is a limiting factor in these. We have evergreen coniferous forests, the boreals and taigas. They have very cold winters. Think about Canada. This would be just north of where we live by about 100 or 200 miles. Few species of cone-bearing trees. So if you think about Christmas trees, holiday trees, that's the kind of thing, pine trees that you need to think about with this. A huge limiting factor is slow decomposition. The coastal coniferous forests, obviously along regions of like Washington State and Oregon State have these. Temperate rainforests come into play with this, where we have temperate rainfall. This would be like northern Canada, where we have ample rain, but we have trees that are conifers like this. They're found in scattered coastal regions, also in Mediterranean regions. California is a good example. Mountains definitely play a huge ecological role. I've talked about this already. Very steep in elevation. Majority of the world's forests are actually in tree areas. If you ever see where they're cutting down a lot of trees, like out in Washington State, it's in very, very mountainous regions. They tend to have islands of biodiversity, so we have a lot of patches of trees, for example, growing in different areas, and that's going to support different biodiversities in different areas. A lot of habitats for endemic species. Endemic species are when a species only lives in one part of the world. For example, in Madagascar, we have some creatures that only live in Madagascar. So what happens if they're threatened or if they become wiped out there, they're going to be extinct throughout the world. They do help regulate the Earth's climate. When we talked about windward and leeward side, that's an example. They're a major storehouse for water, very, very big role in the hydrologic cycle. So what have we done to the world's ecosystems? We've actually disrupted ecosystems and economic services provided by many deserts, grasslands, forests, and mountains. About 60% of the world's major terrestrial ecosystems are being degraded. Human ecological footprint is spreading, and of course, that's especially like in China now. So what are we doing? Well, with deserts, we're put large cities in. Desert regions are flat. We can build in them very easily. Phoenix is an example. Las Vegas is an example. We're destroying soil and underground habitat by off-road vehicles. So a very common thing is to get a four-wheeler out or even a Jeep and go in different off-roading events, and that causes vegetation to die. And then, of course, we get a process called desertification. Depletion of groundwater. Areas like Phoenix, they have groundwater which is resupplied by the rainfall or snowfall rather in the Rocky Mountains, and then when it melts, of course, it comes down and resupplies it. But what happens is as their population goes up, they're depleting their groundwater quite a bit. Land disturbance and problems from mineral extraction too. These regions, deserts, oftentimes are where we get things like gold and copper and silver, and of course that's going to devastate our environment too. Grasslands, we're converting them to croplands because they're flat. They're very easy to convert. The problem is we need to add a lot of nutrients to it to bring it up to speed to grow the plants that we need. It releases CO2 to the atmosphere from the burning of grasslands too. Overgrazing by livestock, again, if we overgraze too much, what happens is then we get desertification because we lose the vegetation and it kind of turns into a desert. Oil production, off-road vehicles, and Arctic tundra also. I talked about that with the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. Forests, kind of like where we live, we clear them for agriculture, livestock, grazing, timber. Urban development, we convert diverse forests to tree plantations, so we grow the type of trees we want, like Christmas trees or fruit trees. Damage from off-road vehicles, pollution of forest streams also. And mountains, we're trying to do agriculture on mountains. That's a type of agriculture called contour, where we build on the side. Timber and mineral extraction also from these regions, like out in the great northwestern part of the United States. Hydroelectric dams and reservoirs are oftentimes put in the mountains because as the snow melts, it runs down, and we can tap into that for energy resources, and that has some negative environmental effects too. Air pollution blowing in from urban areas and power plants is a problem, and soil damage again from off-road This chart actually shows projected status of biodiversity in 2018, which isn't too far away, resulting from ongoing threats of habitat loss, fragmentation, invasions of non-native species, pollution, climate change, and unsustainable exploitation. Many things we need to talk about, yet fragmentation is when you take away part of a forest, for example, you fragment it. Habitat loss is when you take away the place where a creature lives. That's the number one reason they become extinct. Invasion of non-native species, so a creature comes in from a different part of the world, takes over. Pollution, climate change we'll talk about later too, but take a look at this. What's in red is critical and endangered. What we're doing in the United States, particularly like in the Great Plains, is we're farming that quite a bit. It's a great climate as far as temperatures to farm. The problem is we need to get a lot of groundwater. This is aquifer called the Aglalal Aquifer that's underneath this region. We're draining that so fast, it's unbelievable. Other regions that are critically and endangered are regions like in Africa, Europe, because of increasing populations there. Definitely China here. India is threatened also. A couple stable regions, and there aren't very many of them, are like in the outback of Australia. So those regions haven't been hit so much by over. Size and locations of biomes can definitely change. They're not fixed. We know, looking at this chart, you can see in the last 10,000 years, things have shifted quite a bit, and that's because our climates are shifting quite a bit. The idea of climate change right now is, if we look at St. Louis, which is down in this region right here, and we're up in this region right here, by 2050, if current trends continue, that population, or that climate, is going to shift up like that. So we're going to have the climate of St. Louis, which is much more hot and humid than it is now. So what happens, a lot of human activities are likely to affect biome placement in the future, this idea of climate change. What happens is everything is going to shift up, and what's going to happen is this grassland is actually going to come in closer to where we are right now. It's going to be much drier. Again, change of climate. Big ideas of all this: first of all, differences in climate based on long-term differences in daily temperature and precipitation. So when you define climate, you look at precipitation and temperature. Largely determine the types and locations of the Earth's deserts, grasslands, and forests. Earth's terrestrial systems provide very important ecological and economic services to us, so we need to maintain those in a sustainable manner. Human activities are degrading and disrupting many of the ecological and economic services provided by the Earth's terrestrial systems. That quite a bit more down the road. Deciduous forests and sustainability, we can relate to this. Climate plays a key role in determining the nature of terrestrial systems. Of course, the amount of precipitation we get, the temperatures we get, really drives the vegetation that can live here. The vegetation that lives here really drives the creatures that live here too. The Earth's dynamic climate system helps distribute heat from solar energy and recycling of the Earth's nutrients. And what that was about, remember, as we look at our planet, the most direct area, the equatorial region where the sun hits, the warm, moist air raises because of the Earth's rotation. It'll cool, it'll fall. As it rises up, of course, what it's going to do is condense, and then it's going to rain. That's why so many tropical rainforests are located in the equatorial region. And then it cools off, and we get these convection currents. Of course, in nature, everything is connected. A lot of times, unfortunately, we man tend to manipulate that for our own benefit, and then our system just doesn't work very well. That's it for the second part of Chapter 7.